over an eland which weighs 2,000 pounds. So they had to figure out how to kill the animal without the arrow being the thing that kills them. So of course they figured out poison. And I'll just briefly talk about one poison, which is very, very interesting. Hand this around, but please be very careful. There is a beetle in Botswana, and the larva from the beetle buries itself about 3 feet under the sand. And when a bushman finds this larva, how they ever found it originally, I have no idea. But if you take those larvae and put it in a little container like this, this is pointed so it sits in the sand, and you mash that up, that poison is lethal. We think of mutual destruction being prevented because we and the it's Russia now and China all have nuclear weapons. That's the idea. If you all have nuclear weapons, nobody's going to pull the trigger. The Bushmen had the same idea, except with this poison, because this poison has no known antidote. So if two groups started warring and started shooting each other, they would all die. So they never did that. The poison is quite astonishing. And so are the arrows. You can imagine in the desert that resources are extremely limited. And so everything the Bushmen did, they tried to make sure that they didn't destroy anything that they had, didn't break anything that they had, because they may not be able to replace it. So these containers fitted in the backpack, if you like. So you can imagine a bushman would have to get very close to an animal with that little bow in order to hit it. Some people think that the clicks of the bushmen that are famous, if you ever have a chance, go to YouTube and look for bushman clicks.
Is it a language?
It's a language which has many clicks in it. Most of the black languages in South Africa have 3 clicks. There's the one here, there's one in the front, and there's one, and they just incorporate it into the words. And for people who are not used to it, they're very hard to say. So the idea that I've read is that the Bushmen use these clicks because they don't scare the animals. So they can get close to an animal, and that's telling the other guy something, but it's not scaring the animal. So when they shoot the animal, guess what happens? The animal does what? It runs away. And if it runs through bushes and so on, it's likely to break the arrow. And the Bushmen don't want to do that. So the Bushman arrows have 2 parts. They have the part where they put the poison, and they do not put the poison on the tip because they're scared if they nick themselves, they're a goner. Nothing can stop them dying. So they put the poison on the base of the arrowhead, not on the tip. And then this fits into here.
What's it made of?
This is a reed. This is wood and just metal that's been pounded, which they were able to find in different places.
Do they put the poison before they hunt?
Yes. Oh no, if they see an animal, then they would take that container and then do it. They wouldn't carry it on the tip of the arrow. Time is on their side, so there's no rush. And then you'll notice that the arrow doesn't have flights either. And there's a little notch here which goes on the string of that. So you can imagine that they have to get really close. And then animal runs off, this part falls off, so they save it, it doesn't break. And when they eventually, when the animal falls over, this is still stuck into it, so they can always retrieve this part of the arrow.
How does the poison work?
The poison is it's a good question. This poison eventually it gets into the bloodstream and it changes the ability of the blood to absorb oxygen from the lungs. So it basically drowns, in a sense, not from water, but from an inability of the blood to get oxygen from breathing. And it's a slow process, but it works. And what is really interesting is that you can have an animal die of this poison, and then you can just cut it up and eat it. And since you are ingesting the poison, and it's not getting in your bloodstream, it's safe. I just wonder how many Bushmen must have died figuring all of this out, you know, over the thousands of years. But the whole thing is amazing. But they use other poisons as well, but this is the one that I've always been really fascinated with. Then this is the equivalent of a shovel. One of the things that they eat is called a nama melon. It's a melon that's in the desert. Sometimes it's on the surface, sometimes it's a little underneath. So this would be used for digging. This would also be used for digging for those larvae to make the poison. Very, very hard wood, probably from a tree near the Kavango River, because that's the most verdant part of the country. And then somewhere they would have found a bit of metal, and there's a row of hills in the northwest called Sodillo Hills, which the Bushmen regard as sacred. That's where they think humankind started. And I've been there, the 3,500 to 4,000 Bushmen paintings on the rocks. It's just unbelievable. And there's a place where you can see where all of this type of metal was pounded in the rocks, and it's sort of, it's just pounded away the rocks over the thousands of years. This is for smoking, a cigarette holder. And I'm sure they smoked all sorts of different things. And
What, for example?
sorry?
What type of leaves would they smoke?
I'm sure that they would dry different sorts of leaves. I don't think there was any marijuana in Botswana, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if there were other bushes that had different hallucinogenic effects and so on. And the Bushmen are known for what are called trance dances or trance dances in American, and where they will dance themselves into a trance, and sometimes that can be facilitated by whatever they are smoking. But they wouldn't have had alcohol because they didn't create alcohol. Of course, today, as with many places, alcohol has become a scourge amongst many of them. And then this part is found all over the world to make fire. And these here are probably part of the kindling. I don't actually know that, but with dry grass, this would be the next stage after the dry grass catches, and then you'd slowly build up a fire. Okay, so the sand is very hot, so they made little sandals. And I'll pass these around, and this too, I'm not sure the leather that this comes from, but they're very old. You can see how worn they are, and probably comes from an eland, a 2,000-pound animal, because it's very strong. Now, one of the here's a little thing for probably digging out seeds and stuff, like a little dagger. One of the things that the Bushmen are known for is storytelling. were wonderful storytellers, and loved to dance and so on. And so they had different things that they didn't have musical instruments like we have musical instruments, but they fashioned these rattles, etc., from little different length sticks and so on. So that would be part of their musical instruments. Just be careful with this, please. And at the same time, they would wrap around their legs and their bodies these rattles that they had built from seed pods and so on. And different ones have different sounds and so on. So you can imagine with a big fire and people with these and so on, and of course there'd be some form of percussion, hitting a tree or something like that. That's would be part of the whole process of getting into a trance. And this is just the tail of a wildebeest, which keeping the flies off. I think the flies irritate them as much as they irritate us. And then two other things which I will pass around, but be careful, please. Here's a spear. Sometimes they could use that to get a smaller animal. That would have, it would stick into an eland, but the eland would basically just ignore it and run away. And then this is what in our part of the world is called a knob kiri. It's part of a tree. This is the sort of a branch. This comes from the central part, and you hit animals or people over the head with that. And it's very, very hard. You would not want to be hit over the head with that.
How much would a person weigh, the little people? These seem so heavy.
Everybody here is much bigger than any of them. Much, much bigger. I think you'd be looking at in our world the equivalent of maybe a 12-year-old, 11-year-old. Less than 5 feet tall, very, very skinny.
But that's not pygmy, right?
No, the pygmies are different. The pygmies are further north in Africa. But very, very small and slender.
Do they still use all of these tools?
Yeah, good question. Today, most of the nomadic bushmen have gone. And there are, there's so many interesting stories about that, but we just don't have time. But basically, there was a big conflict between the government and the bushmen. The government constitutionally is required to provide schooling and healthcare for everybody in the country. That's very hard to do for nomads. And it's even harder to do when the nomads are in the middle of the Kalahari Desert. So the government said all bushmen have to go and live in a one place. And they built a little village called New Ade. And we've been there several times, and it is one of the saddest places you can be. These people have been sort of either forced there or they've realized ultimately it may be better to go there when they don't have to wander around for days trying to find water and food. But it's just very, very sad. And I suspect some of the Indian areas in this country have very similar feel to them. So no, they're not, there may be a couple, but the people now who I see with these type of implements and so on are the people that the tourists go and see. So they're probably, I'm making the number up, 500,000 people who regard themselves as Bushmen in northern Botswana, northern South Africa, and in Namibia. They generally live in areas. Some of them reservations, similar to what has happened here, and in general, I think rather depressing. Of course, there are fewer and fewer who are 100% Bushmen because of intermarriages and rape and all those sorts of things that have happened, over the last few hundred years. But they still a lot of them are still wonderful trackers, and some police forces in that area use Bushmen as trackers because they've had this long history of having to follow animals. There's an amazing story. The Tsadillo Hills, the birthplace of humankind, has all these Bushman paintings. And one rock face has a couple of paintings that have always astonished me. The hills are about 300 miles away from the Atlantic Ocean as the crow flies through the desert. And yet on this one panel of rock face, there is a painting of a penguin and the painting of two whales. Now, whales and penguins occur on the Namibian Atlantic coast. We have plenty of penguins in South Africa called the African penguin. But how did they get there? I mean, I'm sure that getting there was easy. How did they get back to the right place? No GPSs. What were they looking at? What things did they observe that allowed them to navigate that far so accurately? Amazing. Oh, yes, of course, like all human beings, Bushmen have kids. And kids need to be entertained. So there is a little hunting outfit for the kids. Here's the little bow. I'm not convinced this is originally way back when. And here are the little arrows that go with it, the little notches here. These heads don't come off like the other ones, and they're not metal tips, but it's rather cute. And this is a leather piece with little beadwork at the top, which is sort of generally very common in Africa. Beads are a big thing. So, questions, more questions.
Do they have a percussion instrument and string instruments?
I have never seen that group of people with a string instrument. There are plenty of string instruments in Africa, but I've never seen from the Bushman group.
And on the gatherings or dances, do they dance? Do they sing?
They sing, and again, we can't speak the language, but a lot of it is noise rather than words. So humming and chanting. You remember the Swingle singers? They would sing songs, but no words. And from what we understand, that's what it is. And when they get into the trance, in their heads, they are leaving their body and are going to visit their ancestors, who are the stars in the sky. And when they come to, their spirit has returned to their physical body. Yes.
What did you pay for those goodies?
What did I pay?
I'm just curious.
Honestly, I bought it probably 60 years ago.
60 years ago.
Yeah. I haven't the faintest.
It's kind of a
idea.
treasure.
Oh, it is.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I think most museums would like to have something of this age.
Mm-hmm.
You can get modern replicas, of course, but I think all of this, with maybe the exception of the kids thing, I bought this 60 years ago too, but I think with this, but I think this, the original piece, could easily be 100 or more years. I mean, people, didn't get rid of them, so.
Why did they sell it?
The person I bought it from was probably the least likable person I've ever met. and I'm quite sure he was a mercenary throughout Africa, and whether he bought it or took it, I know where I would put my money.
So you didn't really get it from a Bushman?
I didn't get it from a Bushman.
Okay.
There was this intermediary.
Okay.
As I say, he was just awful.
Okay.
Did they live in villages or what?
There are really historically two types of Bushmen. The word Bushman is a pejorative word. It's the English translation of a Dutch word which was pejorative, Busman. There is no good word to use to call them, because they don't have a word for themselves. You know, it's we and they, and you can't call them we. So you have to find an alternative. So Bushman is one, Basawa is the Setswana word, it's also pejorative. But the words that are mostly used now in more academic circles are Khoi San. And the Khoi are the group of Bushmen who tended to be sedentary, lived in communities, and the San were the nomadic groups. So in Botswana, largely because of the natural terrain, etc., most of them were San. They had to move because of lack of resources.
And their women would just go with them?
There would be a group, maybe 12 or 15, and it would be men, women, and kids. And some, you know, occasionally they would bump into other groups, and I'm sure sometimes that's when sort of marriages took place, and etc. But they were, because of the lack of resources, you couldn't have a large number of people, because if you came to a waterhole and you were philosophically required to leave it, a lot of it, when you left, big groups just didn't work. So generally the groups were very small.
And what kind of structures did they have then? Did they have any?
No.
Even the ones that stayed in one place didn't have like a...
Well, I think again they would be very similar to here, that there would be a community, and the community would decide, and I'm sure there were debates and so on. I'm sure there were disagreements about things to do, but if there was a leader, it would be somebody that people thought was good. It was an informal thing as far as we know. We've spent much more time studying the San people rather than the Khoi because of where we set our books. But in general, I think they just sort of sat around and said, this is what we're going to do. They didn't vote.
But I mean, they didn't have a house, they didn't have a tent, they didn't have anything that they...
The people, the nomads, would make little thing from the grass where they are. The Khoi, the people who were more sedentary, it would vary, but they would also have some more permanent structures, a little also from grass. And if you look at any books, in southern Africa, you see lots of grass, original grass, round grass structures. Theirs were much less organized, much lighter, much more flimsy than the ones that the Zulus, for example, or the Xhosa would have.
The average temperature?
Depends, like everywhere else. Very hot in the middle of summer in the desert, and pretty cold at night in the winter. So.
The Bushmen in
Namibia.
Yes.
Nambia, if you're a very certain president.
Yes.
He didn't quite get it right.
Were they discriminated against, like in
Absolutely,
Botswana?
by
Just
everybody.
Same there.
The pecking order was, for a long time, it's changed now, thank goodness, was whites, blacks, Bushmen. And And as I said, they were regarded as animals by many groups 100 years ago. You could get a permit to hunt them. Terrible.
You mentioned disagreements, and I'm bringing you back to your writing partner and you. How do you decide who writes what, or do you just send things back and forth and you add and take away, or how does that work?
Yeah, so we do everything. We both do everything. So let's say we're about to start on a new book. We'll try to get together, usually in South Africa, because I spend the Minnesota winters in Cape Town. How does that work, I wonder? And so we choose a backstory. That's all of our books have backstories that are relevant to that part of the world. So Carrying Death, our first book, the backstory is blood diamonds, because lots of diamonds in that part of the world, Angola and in Botswana and Namibia. The second one, The Second Death of Good Luck Tinubu, the backstory is the aftermath of the Rhodesian Civil War. Two people, one from each of the sides, land up in a tourist camp in Botswana. The third one, Death of the Mantis, the backstory is the quest of a bushman to try and maintain the bushman culture and protect a mythical Tsodilo Hills, where the birthplace of humankind. The fourth one is very interesting. We were encouraged to write the fourth one earlier than, when we went to Botswana, before we published our first book, after much trying, we got time with the director of the Criminal Investigation Department. And he spent a whole Saturday afternoon showing us the ropes and taking us places, telling us things that happened in Botswana. And he said one thing that stuck with us. He said, I want you to write a story about what are called Muti murders. These are things that happen in sub-Saharan Africa, where a witch doctor, there are not many of them who do this, will kill a human being, harvest some of the parts, and make a medicine, a potion, to give to somebody. And our story is based on a true story that happened in Botswana in 1995 or 6, I think. There was a young girl, Mokhomotsi Segametsi, who was killed. She was about 12 years old, and her sex organs were harvested. And the idea was that witch doctor would make a potion, and the client almost certainly would be a rich politician or a rich businessman or woman. Maybe the woman was infertile and would go to a person like this and say, I need to be fertile, and the witch doctor would say, I know how to fix that. Put $10,000 in my pocket. And it's fascinating because I don't think any of these have been solved. And the reason for that is, there are 3 reasons actually. The first is most murders occur between people who know each other. So, so when a murder happens, the police immediately look at the people around, or people, business dealings, or lovers, or relatives, but there's almost always a connection between the victim and the perpetrator. Not so in these Muti murders, because the witch doctor is trying to get a resource. If it's a politician, they may go for a lion, but they may go for a strong man's heart. Or if it's a woman, go for, as I said, a beautiful young girl's sex organs. There may be no connection between the witch doctor and the victim, other than what the witch doctor sees. So that makes investigation really difficult. Secondly, the police are scared because almost always the person who bought the potion from the witch doctor is rich and influential. And thirdly, and this is equally important, is the police are scared of catching a witch doctor. because the witch doctor could easily put a spell on them. And it is, I mean, there's plenty of evidence that a spell put on somebody by a powerful witch doctor has an effect. It's in the mind. But if the person's mind believes they have had a spell, they can die sometimes. Also, so everything is stacked against finding the perpetrator. And in the case that I told you about, the people in the area, a little town called Machudi, eventually got so pissed off at the police that they started protesting. And it got worse, and another person was killed in those protests. And eventually the government of Botswana said, hold it, we're going to get an outside agency to investigate it. I know you don't trust the police. We're going to get Scotland Yard from England, because there's always been a connection between Botswana and England. And so Scotland Yard sent some people out, and they investigated, and they wrote a report, which has never been made public. So guess what was in it? I can't wait for the statute of limitations to I probably won't be around, but so very interesting. So that's the fourth one. The fifth one, the backstory is the influence of Chinese companies in Africa. There are hundreds of huge company projects run by and staffed by Chinese. The sixth one, Dying to Live, supposes that, well, a bushman is found dead on the side of the road in the middle of the desert. It looks like it's probably he just died of old age. He's old and wizened, and his hair's all silver, but he has some contusions on his body, so the police have to just check it out. So they send the body to Gaborone for an autopsy, and Ian McGregor, the pathologist, is astonished to find that even though this very old bushman is on his table, the internal organs of the bushman are of a young man. And he finds a bullet embedded in one of the abdominal muscles, and there's no entry wound. So guess what? People think the bushman has found a plant that prolongs life. And can you imagine the chaos when people find that? Everybody thinks they can make a huge amount of money. So that's the backstory of it. And we don't have the time. There is a real plant called Hoodia, which was the properties of which were stolen. It suppressed appetite. And so the backstory of ours is about biopiracy, where civilized countries find some of these things that the more primitive people have discovered over thousands of years, and steal the idea and don't give anything back to the people who found it out. It's called biopiracy. And there was, in fact, a plant called Hoodia, which does suppress appetite. The Bushmen used it when they were running after these animals. And it was synthesized in South Africa and then sold to a big pharmaceutical company in Europe. And there was enough protest by human rights groups and so on, and a big court case, and eventually there was a settlement that the Bushmen would get a certain percentage of the profits of the sale of it. The sad thing is they never made profits because it was a bit of a scam. I mean, it works, but they couldn't synthesize it and prove that it actually suppressed appetite. So they didn't get anything.
Well, we want to be respectful of your time and the audience.
Me, I'm willing to talk as long as people are interested.
I just have
I
one
don't
more,
come here very often, so I'd love to do that.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
If you were gonna start reading the series, would you start with the facets of death, or would you start, what order would you read those?
Okay, I'm gonna talk with a forked tongue. Okay. There are actually two ways now. A year or two ago, there was only, I mean, you could pick up any book, because they're all standalones in a sense, but of course there is the thread of the family and all of that. So generally we would have said start with A Carrion Death and then read those 6 books. But now we have 2 starts. We have Carrion Death, where he's an assistant superintendent, or we have Facets of Death, where he's a real newbie. So I would say if you're going to be in the beginning, I would start with Facets of Death, not the book we've just brought out, shooting himself in the foot. But you could also easily start with A Carrion Death and then find out where he came from at a later stage. Both of those would work.
Okay. I'll start with that process, 'cause I'd like to be a little bit.
Well, you may have other questions that you can come up with.
Yeah, please do.
But
Yeah.
thank you so much.
As I said, thank you very much for arranging this, and I just love coming to libraries like this and chatting to readers. We usually learn a lot from our readers. They find things in our book that we didn't know were there. Not only misspellings.
Yeah.
So how do we get your books?